Folks, if I can have your attention, we'll call ourselves to order and get started with the program. I just walked in, so I don't know if you said grace over lunch yet. Did anybody pray? No. Well, maybe we ought to do that. I think at morning prayer, was it today or yesterday? I think it was yesterday. The psalm was, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. That might be appropriate at this moment since maybe you had your lunch already. But let's say a more suitable and fitting grace as well. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this Easter week, for a time to celebrate your life amongst us in your risen presence. Bless the work that we are called to do, to those who are committed to our charge, and give hope and inspiration and success to all the dreams and aspirations we have on their behalf. Bless our conversation here today and our speaker, and may all that we do be done to your glory and to the building of your kingdom. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'm Joseph Britton, the dean at Berkeley Divinity School, one of the sponsors of this program. It's a delight to welcome you all here on behalf of Berkeley and the Yale Divinity School and the Center for Faith and Culture. Skip Mosbach, your usual host, is home ill with the flu, that post-Easter letdown that many of us fall prey to. So he sends his greetings, but is unable to be here today. For the speaker, we welcome back Andy Root, who is here for a second time. And then just remind you that in the series, there's one speaker left. On May 7th will be Tom Troger, the professor of preaching here at Yale Divinity School. But today we have Andy for a second time, and you probably remember that he comes from Luther Seminary in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a delight to have him back, and the advertised topic is practicing discernment with youth. That has been refined a little bit to talking about sin with youth. So a particular form of discernment within the larger topic. So Andy, come tell us how to talk about sin with youth. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. I had imagined there would be like 5 people here. After Easter, you would all just want to lay on the couch and watch Family Guy reruns or something. So thanks for showing up. It's great to be here. I do want to talk about talking about sin with young people. Not probably the sexiest topic, but probably a pretty significant one. And maybe significant because it's not always that easy to do and to figure out. So let me give you 2 stories that will kind of set as motifs to kind of get into this topic. And they're 2 stories I actually told when I was here about 15 months ago, but they're good stories, so if you've heard them before, just act like you haven't. But I have 2 children. I have a 5-year-old in kindergarten, and then I have an 8-year-old in 2nd grade who is this great existential, angsty 2nd grader who asks these big questions. But both of our children, when they were born, I don't know what we did, but we passed on some terrible genetic disease to them, which is that they didn't sleep until they were like 18 to 20 months old. See, and I can always tell people who are compassionate and have had the experience because you're like, oh, may God have mercy on you. And I can tell the people who haven't had the experience because you're just eating away like, what's the big deal? Well, let me tell you, if it hasn't happened to you, really may God have mercy on your soul because it's awful. It's terrible experience. You're up every 2 hours with this kid, and you really think that you are either going to kill them or kill yourself. Now, the good news, I guess, of our age is this is a Google age, so we can find all the information we need about everything. Whether it's good information or not, we don't know, but you can find this information. So when neither of our kids would sleep, we would go onto Google and type in things like kids will not sleep, help, and they would come up with strategies. And then you get more desperate and you type in kids will not sleep, afraid I will kill myself, and see what Google would say. And then you get really desperate and type in kids will not sleep, I'm convinced I will kill them. And then Google gives you more. But we were looking for any sleep strategy to get our kids to sleep, and we actually came across one that came from a much more conservative perspective than we were comfortable with, but we were desperate here. I mean, we weren't sleeping through the night, so beggars can't be choosers. We were willing to look at anything. Well, this perspective, as we read it on the internet, said that the minute you take your daughter home from the hospital, I mean, when she is just a day or 2 old, and you take her home, and you lay her in your crib, and walk away, and she starts to cry, you never go to her, was the theory. The theory was, after all, your infant is sinful. And if you go when she cries, you give into her sinful will. If you go only on your schedule, you will bend her will towards obedience. Now, we were desperate people, but not quite that desperate. But the interesting thing is it came with a certain theological perspective, a certain understanding of sin, that sin was based in the will and trying to get this kid, even as an infant, to do the right thing. Now, a few months later, when our daughter was born, and she was probably, a couple months old, we had done the kind of classic American thing of putting your infant on your bed for a nap. And we had the baby monitor that was broadcasting her upstairs, and we were downstairs. And after about 2 hours, we started to realize this was a pretty long nap. I mean, it was glorious, but it was a long nap. I mean, it was great for her to be on her own for a while, but this had become quite a long nap. Now, I think it's illegal in like 5 states, but what had happened is we had actually had the baby monitor switched to the wrong channel. And some of you have had this experience before too, that they don't have some kind of default mechanism to tell you if they aren't broadcasting. So you are just blissfully living your life, and your child is upstairs bawling its head off. And that's exactly what happened here, is I finally walked by our stairs and heard her screaming absolutely bloody murder. So I turned to my wife, Cara, and said, Cara, we got to get upstairs. Maisie is crying. And Owen, who was about 2.5 at the time, was like, forget about that kid. He can go play in the street. We have to save the youngest one. So we rushed up the stairs, totally forgetting about Owen, the oldest. And he kind of followed us up the stairs as we raced. And we got to the bed, and there she was, laying on the bed, kicking her arms and her legs, and her face was red, and she was mad. She was doing one of those cries, not like, hey, I'm awake. It was kind of one of those cries like, the universe now is a dark place. I don't know how I'm going to move forward. Where are you people? And she was doing one of those cries where the face was red and no noise was coming out for a second. Like, she was angry. So we picked her up and we started soothing her and saying, Maisie, it's okay. Don't cry, baby. Maisie, it's okay. It's okay. Well, as we were kind of holding her over her bed, soothing her, Owen, the 2.5-year-old, climbs up on the bed and then beautifully comes over to her and starts touching her head. And then he starts kissing it. He says, don't cry, baby Maisie. Don't cry. And then he says to her, don't cry, baby Maisie. You just have HOTUS. You just have HOTUS, baby Maisie. And now we stop, and he's got our attention. And we say, Owen, what is HOTUS, this made-up 2.5-year-old word? And he looks at us matter-of-factly like, how can't you idiots know what this is? He looks at us and says, oh, you know, HOTUS is when you're all alone and crying and there's no one there to be with you. It's when you're all alone and crying and there's no one there to be with you. And we looked at him and said, yeah, I think I've had that. I think I've had HOTUS before. And maybe another way to think about sin, as opposed to the first one, the first motif, where it's really about bending young people's will towards doing the right thing, that maybe the reality of sin is much deeper, that it's this reality of being all alone and crying and needing someone to be with us. And we have those experiences when we're 9 months or 9 years old or 19 years old or 49 years old. And so I want to use those two motifs as we move into asking how we actually talk about sin with young people. Now, the truth of talking about sin with young people is it's hard. And it's hard because, not because it isn't somewhat concrete. I mean, Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American theologian, said that actually sin is the only empirically provable Christian doctrine. I mean, just open up, your news feed and you can see proof of it. But nevertheless, it's hard because it's so easy to confuse it or abuse it or misuse it. And almost every children's sermon analogy doesn't quite get it right. Or every kind of nail your sins on the cross and burn them the last night of camp works but doesn't quite necessarily work. And I'm sure all of you have tried the object lesson before. Maybe you haven't, and you can steal this if you want, though it's maybe a little problematic. But where you take the water up front and you have all those kind of sodas or Gatorades, and you pour a little bit into a big glass thing of water, and you say things like, this is when you made out with your boyfriend too vigorously, and this is when you lied to your mom, and this is when you drove the car when you weren't supposed to, and the water becomes all gross and disgusting, and then you take another vial and it says Jesus on it, and it's actually bleach, which I don't know what that exactly means, but that if you drink it, it will kill you. I don't know. But then you pour it into that dirty water, and it turns it clear. And then you tell kids all those things they've done wrong have dirtied the water of their life. And Jesus becomes this kind of toxin poison, I guess, that cleans up the water. And so many times we talk about Jesus when we're talking about sin with young people is that Jesus kind of becomes this antidote to this kind of disease that they have. Or another way to think about it is that Jesus becomes kind of the function to make them better people. Or Jesus becomes Ritalin. Jesus becomes something that helps them behave and act a certain way. So we tend to actually turn sin, I think, into doing bad things. That when we talk about sin with young people, we make it doing bad things. So I was teaching a class up in Canada a few summers ago, and it was an intensive class, a block class. And so we were meeting all the students, and I was asking them what they were doing in their ministry, and they were kind of introducing themselves by talking about their ministries. And one of the young women said, well, at our church, we just got done doing Vacation Bible School. And of course, the interesting thing about Vacation Bible School across North America is that if you go to church ever, you tend to go to Easter and Christmas, and then you send your kids to Vacation Bible School because it's free. It's free daycare for a week. This is why my kids go to 6 different ones. People tend to do it. So these kind of unchurched Canadians kind of sent their kids to this Vacation Bible School, and this woman was kind of unpacking that experience. And she said, it came to Thursday. Now, I don't know if you guys know on Vacation Bible Schools that Thursday, I had a friend who actually did research on Vacation Bible School curriculums, and Thursday is always Kill Jesus Thursday. So this summer when it's Thursday, think, oh yeah, hey, it's Kill Jesus Thursday. It's just that every Vacation Bible School curriculum, Jesus gets killed on Thursday. So in this particular Vacation Bible School, Jesus gets killed on Thursday, and they tell these, elementary age kids, they tell them that Jesus needed to die for them because they were all sinners. So the little girl goes home, 6-year-old, and she tells her mom asks her, what did you learn at Vacation Bible School? And she says, well, I learned that I was a sinner. Well, mom comes back on Friday to drop kid off, and mom says, hey, to the teacher, she says, hey, listen, I get it, this is a church, and you're supposed to talk about these things, but come on, my daughter is 6 years old. She hasn't done anything wrong. Don't tell her she's a sinner. Come on. Now, as my student was saying this, she was kind of reflecting on, geez, it's so hard to talk about Christianity in a kind of post-Christian Canada. And I didn't know her well enough to say this at the time, but I kind of thought to myself, I think I agree with the mother. And I think I agree with the mother if we equate sin with just doing bad things. If sin is only doing bad things, it becomes really hard to convince our young people that actually a general who does a genocide is the same as you lying to your mom about having an extra cookie. I mean, it becomes incredibly irrational. But we tend to do this in youth ministry. We tend to see sin equated with doing bad things. And when we ask kids, junior high kids, high school kids, what's sin, they'll often say, well, it's doing bad things. It's based in your will, like that first motif. It's about bending their will towards obedience. So really the Christian life becomes about trying harder to be a good kid. And in many ways, this is why, at least in my experience, why a lot of middle-class parents tend to send their kids to church in the first place, that they want them to be good kids, and church will help them make good decisions. So youth ministry becomes, in many ways, about sin management. Help manage these kids' sin. Help them behave better, manage their behavior. And parents tend to want this. And it also kind of rests in this way we understand adolescence in America to begin with. We tend to understand adolescence as a time where you are growing, advancing, and preparing. That's what adolescence we tend to define it as. It's a time where you're growing, advancing, and preparing. And a lot of times, parents send their kids to church because on this escalator ride of growth, advancement, and preparation, you want to add a little religious add-on to it to make sure that they don't somehow fall off the escalator ride. So church is really there to make sure that their kids can continue to grow, advance, and prepare. I mean, they want them to like Jesus and stuff, but really they want them to get into a good college and get good grades. And if you can keep them from getting pregnant or driving fast and help them wear their seatbelt, they're really happy about that. So youth ministry really becomes about managing these young people's sin, and your job really is then to help kids be good kids. Now, I get this to an extent. I mean, I'm a parent now, and I have a daughter, and she's 6. And if you could promise me my daughter, if your youth group could promise me my daughter wouldn't have sex until the 2nd year of marriage, I would sell my house and give you the money. I mean, I would do it right now. So, I mean, I'm not trying to beat parents up for this. I understand the anxiety and the need to do this. Maybe another story that illustrates this. I had a friend who just took a job in Indiana, and it was his first day, and he was literally putting his books on the shelf, and a mother rushed into his office and said, hi. And he said, hi, my name's Jeremy. She said, hi, I need you to go talk to my son because he's going to drop out of school. And he's thinking, okay. I mean, he literally had been on the clock for hours. And he found himself then at a coffee shop trying to talk to this kid and thinking, I've never even met this kid. But the mother had come into the office wanting him to kind of make her son do the right thing. And somehow he had this adolescent ability or the skills to get adolescents to do the right thing. And he found it absurd. Like, what am I supposed to say to this kid? And so I'm not trying to minimize that, but so often when that occurs, it really does make sin about doing bad things. Now let me maybe show you a video illustration, a video clip that will illustrate this. And it comes from the documentary that I'm sure many of you have seen, Jesus Camp. Have people seen Jesus Camp? Now, usually when this clip is shown in rooms like this, we like to be horrified and think, wow, this is awful. And I actually kind of do think that that's true as we watch this clip. However, I do want to, setting this up, say that there's some things that this woman is a really good communicator. And she really communicates to her young people in an interesting way, and in a way that she kind of can grab their attention. But I want you to listen to how she frames sin for them. And listen to how based in their kind of will in doing bad things, in doing the right thing, it's kind of framed.
Good evening. You made it. How do you guys like the hair? Fingernails, the eyebrows, and the rest of me. See, we're talking this week about how the devil uses tactics to destroy our lives. The first tactic that he uses is to tempt you with sin. You see, when you first start out as a kid, particularly, because that's when all this stuff starts, when you start out as a kid, sin just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. It looks kind of cute, in fact. Warm and fuzzy. But sin is designed to destroy you. And you feed this baby long enough, and he's going to grow in your life until you got yourself a tiger by the tail. And you don't know which end is up. And what used to seem very innocent now controls your life. The devil goes after the young. Those who cannot fend for themselves. That's why we're trying to help you. We're trying to warn you. And while I'm on the subject, let me say something about Harry Potter. Warlocks are enemies of God. And I don't care what kind of hero they are. They're an enemy of God. And had it been in the Old Testament, Harry Potter would have been put to death. You don't make heroes out of warlocks. This is a generation that's going to stand for purity and righteousness and holiness, and you're going to serve the Lord all the days of your life. And we declare all those things over you. I believe this so much that I have given my whole life to see to it that you get there. I sense in my heart tonight what I heard the Lord say is that there's some kids here that say they're Christians, that go to church all the time, but you're one thing when you're at church and you're another thing when you're at school with your friends. You're a phony and a hypocrite. You do things you shouldn't do. You talk dirty just like all the other kids talk dirty. And it's time to clean up your act. Come up here and get washed. Because we can't have phonies in the army of God. If that's you, put your hands up here. Whoa, baby. Wash your hands. Father, we just wash them with the water of your word. We say, no more, devil, no more. Say it, boys and girls, in the name of Jesus. You know exactly what you need to repent of. Name it. Name it out loud. Name it. What do you need to be forgiven of? No more wishy-washy. No more hypocrisy. Now you go somewhere and pray and you start doing some repenting here.
I haven't got much to say. I just wanted to talk about belief in God, and I've had a hard time doing it. And it's just really hard to do this. Just to believe in God is really hard because you don't see Him. You don't really know Him much. Sometimes I don't even believe what the Bible says. It makes me a faker. It makes me feel guilty and bad because God has always talked to me about that. And I kind of rejected Him.
All right, so there's probably more to say about that clip than we have time for. But the interesting thing about it, it's not my theological tradition. It may be some people's in this room. But one of the interesting things is to think about how she frames sin for these young people. And she really does frame it in the sense that pulls them in on themselves. And you see this poor little boy with the blonde hair that at the end just feels like, I don't know what, I need to do more. I need to be better. I need to stop doing these bad things. And she really does frame sin in the sense of doing these bad things. And this becomes the problem is when we equate sin with doing bad things, we tend to make it about your agency and not God's. It's really about you and your problems and not about what God does for us and with and through us. And the truth is, in youth ministry and children's ministry, it's not really all that hard to make kids scared or really anal or really kind of nervous. Or if they can't rise to that kind of inner fear and anxiety, they tend to be overcome with ambivalence. So we have kids who are just completely ambivalent to our message, or kids who we make just frightened. And sometimes we think the frightened kids are the kids who are actually really faithful. And it may just be that we've frightened them into thinking it's up to them to do something. They need to be better. They need to stop doing bad things. It's interesting when you think of Luther, the great reformer's own story. If there ever was an anxious, anal person, it was Martin Luther. Utterly kind of crazy and a little drunk all the time. I mean, that's Martin Luther. And, Luther's own conversion experience happens in utter anxiety. That he almost gets struck by lightning, he ends up in a monastery, and then when he gets in that monastery, he's going to do it right. I mean, he is going to not do any more bad things. He is actually not going to sin anymore. So he wears his confessor out. Like, he has to meet with him all the time, confessing his sins, and finally the guy's just like, hey, take a deep breath. But he can't. I mean, he's sleeping on a hard bed, starving himself. I mean, Luther is trying not to do any more bad things. But of course, his great theological breakthrough that leads to the Reformation itself is that he realizes sin isn't doing bad things. Sin is what God takes on in Jesus Christ on the cross and overcomes it with life. It's not about him. It's about God's own action that's more significant. But when we talk about sin as doing bad things, we tend to turn kids in on themselves instead of pointing them to the depth of the gospel, which is what God does for them. One of the most famous quotes Luther ever said was, if you're going to sin, sin boldly. Which, if you ever go in the Midwest to a college campus like Gustavus or St. Olaf, you will see people who drink too much with shirts that say, if Luther said, if you're going to sin, sin boldly, so we don't have one beer, we have 8. That's like the justifies their binge drinking. But that's actually not what Luther really meant, right? Well, maybe he did, but that's not the point of the letter. When he writes that letter, he's actually writing it to Melanchthon, his kind of right-hand man in the Reformation. And Melanchthon himself is kind of an anxious person. in this very famous line of Luther, if you're going to sin, sin boldly, which we often take out of context, actually sits in a very interesting context. And the context it sits in is that Melanchthon has written Luther a letter and is very nervous because he says, Luther, if we do this, this could happen. If we do that, that could happen. I don't know what we should do. And he's utterly anxious and frightful. And Luther actually says to him, he says, listen, Melanchthon, God does not forgive hypothetical sins. Live your life. You are free. Live. And if you are going to sin, sin boldly. He didn't mean, if you're going to steal something, you might as well rob a bank. His point was, live. God has acted for you. God has justified you. Now live your life. And how often young people that come to our churches get the opposite message. That when we talk about sin, we tend to talk about making them anal and frightful. And what should I do? We don't tend to release them to live their lives and seek for God in the midst of it. But it does lead us then to ask the question, so what really is sin? We want to kind of take a turn away from sin being doing bad things. Then what is sin? Well, original sin, or as in some traditions they call it total depravity, is actually a state of brokenness. It's a state of lostness. It's a state of wrestling with nothingness. And of course, it has its origins in Augustine and the book of Romans. It has something a lot more to do with Hodis. It's about being all alone and crying and needing someone to be with us. And this is a universal experience we have of living in brokenness and lostness. So it's this universal experience of losing relationship, of being alone. There's a scholar who taught for many years at Princeton Seminary named James Loder, who died just after 9/11. And he was a very interesting man and a very interesting scholar. And one of the most interesting things is his biography. And what had happened to him is that he had kind of top of his class at Harvard, ended up teaching down at Princeton, was a young scholar, and he went on vacation one holiday, and he was on the New York Turnpike, and he pulled his car over to help two women who were also on holiday change a flat tire. And while he was helping changing this flat tire, a driver of a semi-truck had fallen asleep at the wheel, hit the car that he was working on, and pinned him under the car and pushed him for nearly 50 yards under it. And his wife then had this kind of moment of utter strength and lifted the car off him and pulled him to the side. And he said he felt himself dying. But as he felt this experience of dying, he also felt an overwhelming movement of the Holy Spirit. And so he actually ended up surviving this tragic experience and became this very odd duck at Princeton Seminary who spent the rest of his career trying to write on this experience he had of the Spirit. What is it about the Holy Spirit? But one of the things Loder says in many of his works, and as he's analyzed as well as done research with psychologists, is one of the hardest things to get people to talk about in clinical psychological conversations. The hardest thing for clinical psychologists to get people to talk about is actually loneliness. That people have the hardest time talking about loneliness. And they think that's the case because loneliness is the closest experience we have to death. That loneliness is the closest experience we have of it. So this means then that we have to, with our young people, draw a difference between sin as the state of our being and sinning as the bad things that we do. And like I said, if you ask most young people in our ministries, at least the young people I know, they always say sin is doing bad things, not as the state of being broken and being alone. So this reality of sin is first and foremost a tragic reality. It's something tragic. It's about broken impossibility and broken relationship. My son, who I told you is this kind of since he's been 4, has been this kind of ask these big, deep questions that I tell people all over the place. But we were just on vacation in Hawaii a few weeks ago, which you can feel bad for me or hate me. But we were on Hawaii. My wife and I wanted to get back there so bad. It took us 12 years to get back there. But we were with him, and just the angsty kid he is, we're watching this beautiful sunset as the sun drops into the Pacific Ocean. And he comes up to me and he says, "You know what, Dad? I've realized life is impossible." And he's like, "It's just impossible." He's like, "It's impossible. And no matter what, it's impossible. Because even no matter what you do, everyone's life, it ends. It's impossible." And there's part of me that's like, dude, look at the sun. Don't worry about that. But there's another piece that the beauty of the sunset was what triggered this in him. that this is so beautiful, and life is for the living. But this is what's so tragic about life, is that all of us have this kind of expiration date. And that's essentially what he was saying. It's impossible, because even at its most beautiful, life, you can't always just hold on to it. There's something about it that you can't always possess. I used to have a seminary professor that often he would say in a lecture, 8 a.m. lecture, he would say, "For most of you, that which will kill you is already in your body." You're like, wow, this is a great morning devotion. Thank you very much. But he'd say, for most of you, that which will kill you is already in your body. Most of us, our arteries are already hardening, or the blood vessel in our head is weakening. I mean, some of us may die tragically by the hand of another human being, for God's sake, or in a car accident. But for a lot of us, that which will kill us is already in our body. This fact that our very lives unfold and are tragic, and we have to deal with these realities. And maybe this is the way to think about sin in a much deeper way, to think of it as the violation of broken relationship with God that leads to this reality of tragedy and brokenness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, actually, in this beautiful book, Creation and Fall, talks about this. And the interesting kind of backstory of Bonhoeffer writing this book in 1932-ish is that he was teaching a confirmation class. And he was teaching a confirmation class because he was the young, newly ordained person in his Berlin area. And literally this confirmation class was so out of control, this is not a lie, they killed the previous teacher. They didn't kill him literally, but they drove this man so nuts that he had to get rid of the confirmation class, and he died 6 weeks later. Seriously. So they killed him. So if you think your confirmation is bad, your confirmation class is bad, this confirmation class that Bonhoeffer took over had killed their previous teacher. But Bonhoeffer's lecturing to these university students at the University of Berlin and teaching this confirmation class. But in this book, Creation and Fall, Bonhoeffer makes this beautiful articulation where he says that the sin, the original sin, was actually the violation of the center. That Adam and Eve violated the center, that the tree at the center, it wasn't about God hoarding fruit, that the tree represented the difference between God and humanity. And it was there as a gift so that they might be in relationship. And essentially what Adam and Eve did was that they violated the boundary between God and humanity. And there can be no relationship in enmeshment, and they lose this interconnection. And I think it had a lot to do with the questions Bonhoeffer was being asked in his confirmation class. I mean, I'm sure many of you have been asked, really, God is angry because people ate God's fruit? Come on, God, get over it. So our point is, don't eat things that don't belong to you. I mean, what's the point of the Christian life? But Bonhoeffer beautifully frames it next to the biblical text that really the heart of sin is this broken relationship and the breaking of the communion between humanity and God. So it's about this broken impossibility. Karl Barth actually says this. He says, particular sins do not alter the state of a person. They merely show how heavy the general domain of sin as this broken reality presses upon them. Sin is the sovereign power in the world, this tragic world, in the world as we know it. And it is wholly irrelevant what particular form in our life, in the life of each individual. So it's not about the bad things you do, but it's this tragic reality that we live within. The problem is that when we make sin only doing bad things for our young people, then we tend to give them, and discipleship becomes about giving them riddles to avoid doing bad things. And this often happens with junior high kids, at least in my own ministry it did. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with junior high boys about Matthew 5:28. You know, that if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery. Have you ever actually had an honest conversation with 7th and 8th grade boys about this text? They're like, come on, what do you mean? The Bible really says this? Have you been to my school? Do you see what these girls wear? All I do all day is lust after them. What are you telling me to do? And I remember in my own ministry, framing sin as doing bad things, the whole objective was to keep kids from thinking lustful thoughts about other kids in their class. And we never, ever talked about the deeper reality of that biblical text, which is to see the women of which we encounter as human beings and not as objects, to be in communion with them and see them as human beings. Instead, we just tried to keep them from doing bad things. So we gave them bracelets and we gave them things that they could do, but we never got to the bigger, larger issue of being separated from those we call brother and sister and seeing them as objects instead of others to love. So when sin becomes about doing bad things, then it really just becomes about them. But when we frame it out and to think of it as this tragic, broken reality, then it moves us to talk deeper about it. It's not just trying to convert young people to behave better, but to talk about deeper things in their lives. So now we need to talk about deeper things. We need to make sin not about maneuvering around it, but rather a tragic reality where we need to seek God within it. So now we talk about sin. We also talk about the fact that many of them feel isolated and alone. We talk about the divorce that they've experienced between their parents. We talk about the ways that they feel pushed out and isolated, that it leads us to talk in a much deeper way about the very human experience that they have. Maybe an example of this is that I actually wrote this article, and you can find it online. And I wrote it because I was at this big kind of conference, and they had a bunch of resources out. And there was this book with this very cute title that was called When Church Kids Go Bad. And I think it was like a spin-off. Remember when Fox was running these reality shows like When Wild Animals Go Bad and When Monster Trucks Go Bad? It was just like, these sensationalized weird things. So they had this cute little title of this book, When Church Kids Go Bad. So I don't know. I mean, I thought it was a cute title, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way theologically. So I wrote an article called Why Church Kids Must Go Bad. And you should have, the conversation online, I wasn't very popular for that one. But my point basically was that there is a sense in the context of our ministries where if we see our world as this kind of broken place, that we need to invite young people to articulate those experiences. That it's not just about converting their behavior, but actually invite them into deeply wrestling with those things that actually haunt them. And one of the things that was in my mind was this young woman that was in my own ministry. She was an 11th grader, and she was a straight A student. And she was this young woman that literally, if you asked her, think of something you've done bad, like a bad thing that you've done, she would have a hard time ever thinking of anything that she had done bad. I mean, she was just a perfectly conventional, good kid. Except at the end of her junior year, she got caught completely out of character for cheating on a calculus exam. She had put in answers on her calculator. And it was a shock to her parents, a shock to everyone, that she had actually done this. Well, finally, after talking to her, and her parents had kind of pulled me into this conversation, she basically confessed to it, and she said, listen, she said, I started to do these practice exams, and I wasn't going to get an A. And I got scared. I got really scared I wasn't going to get an A, and then I thought, if I don't get an A, I'm not going to have a 4.0, and if I don't have a 4.0, I don't know what college I'm going to get into, and if I don't get into a college, what are my friends' parents going to think, and what are my own parents going to think, and what are my friends going to think, and I just got really, really scared, and I just didn't know who I was if I didn't have a 4.0, so I did this. So she does this bad thing because she can't face her own kind of broken reality within herself. She can't face her own dark questions that she has to wrestle with. So my wife is actually the talented person in our family, and the seminary that we went to, she actually won the preaching prize at it, which came with a significant grant that allowed you to kind of take the money and travel with it. And the idea was that you would go to Cambridge or Oxford, and you would have this kind of international experience, and it would make you a deeper kind of preacher. And talk about an existential crisis, that she won this and I didn't. I still to this day have not lived that down. Like when we're arguing about something, she'll just say, I won the preaching prize. It's like, all right, so I'll take the garbage out. So we took this money, and a few people actually before us had taken the money and traveled around the world with it. They didn't just go to one institution. They actually bounced around, and when we read that, we were like, all right, yeah, that's what we're doing. So we put everything we owned in a storage site and flew west. And it just felt like it was God's will that we stopped in Hawaii, for 10 days. So this is my second reference of Hawaii in this conversation. So we stopped in Hawaii for a while, and then we went to Australia, and then we were in the Middle East for a little while. But we finally ended up in backpacking around Europe. And so we started backpacking around Europe, and we were trying to stretch these dollars of this grant as far as we could. So we were living on like $70, $80 a day. And we were in Italy, in Venice, and we were going to take an overnight train to Nice. And so we couldn't get our own overnight train, so we were going to have to share it with some strangers. Now, I had seen enough horror movies, and I know this is how it starts. Like, this is how the European horror movie starts, is you get killed we're the first victims. Like, this is how it's going to start. So we were very nervous on who these people were going to be that we were going to share this sleeper car with. So we were anxiously waiting, got there early, and kind of calmed our nerves as this young North American from Montreal couple came in, about our age. So we started talking. We were relieved that they weren't going to kill us in the middle of the night now. And if you've ever backpacked around Europe, when you meet people, there's like a code of conduct of things you talk about. And the first thing you talk about is, where have you been? So they told us where they'd been, and we told them where we'd been. And then when you exhaust that conversation, the next thing you talk about is where are you going next? And so they said that they were headed from Nice, they were headed to Barcelona because the wine was flowing, the clubs were hopping, and the weather was warm. And we were the nerds post-seminary on the theological tour of Europe. So we were from Nice, headed up to Geneva to see Calvin sites, then around the Lake of Lausanne, into Basel to see Karl Barth's house, then to Nuremberg for a night before taking a bus into Flossenburg to see the concentration camp where Bonhoeffer was killed. But we realized that was a little bit too nerdy, so we were like, yeah, we're just headed up to Switzerland and then to Germany. And they're like, your rail pass will take you to Barcelona. Yeah, we know we could go to Barcelona, but we're just really kind of interested. We're just totally feeling like complete dorks. So after you exhaust those two conversations, the third thing you talk about is what do you do at home? So they asked us, what do you do at home? So we just finished seminary, so we launched into what was next for us. And Cara said she was going to become an ordained pastor, and I said I was going to try to become an academic theologian, and the looks on their face were priceless. They were just shocked. And now they were convinced we were the people that were going to kill them in the middle of that, And so they just looked at us and were just dumbfounded. And then they both kind of in unison said, oh, cool. And you've had the experience. It's not the kind of cool like, wow, that is so interesting. Tell me about that. It's like, this does not compute, so cool. So we sat in this like pregnant silence for way too long. And finally, the young woman figured she better say something or she would be the first to be killed in the middle of the night. So she turns to us and says, well, I went to confirmation when I was a kid. And we were like, you are fine, child. We will not kill you. And we were like, oh. And then she kind of sat there and she said, yeah, I went to confirmation. She said, but I got kicked out of confirmation because I asked too many disturbing questions. Now, I'm the kind of person who thinks of the absolute perfect thing to say about 30 seconds after it's appropriate. So if you had an overhead view of me and Cara in a fight, you would see us resolve the fight, then me walk away and think, oh, no, now I know why you're wrong, and try to reignite the fight. Never a good thing to do. But this was one of the few times in my life that I thought of the perfect thing to say in the exact moment. So I turned to her, and she said, yeah, I got kicked out of confirmation because I asked too many disturbing questions. And I said, like one of the only times I thought of the perfect thing to say at the time, and I said, that's too bad, because I think the best theologians asked the most disturbing questions. And I think that's quite true with our young people, that our young people as these kind of budding theologians, that when we see sin as doing bad things, we actually cut them off of articulating disturbing things, the disturbing things that they're wrestling with. When we frame sin as a universal reality we all experience of brokenness and tragedy, we actually invite them to articulate that which haunts them, that which is disturbing. It actually becomes the very curriculum to seek for God. And it actually turns them away from themselves and what they can do better into seeking for the very action of God in their lives. So confusing sin and sinning often, confusing making sin just doing bad things, is just really another word of failure to young people. And if there's anything that's true of adolescence, it's about the failure of your own action. Like you really love soccer, but you can never play varsity. You really love that boy or that girl, but they will never date you. I mean, in some sense, adolescence is a time where you experience a great deal of failure. And when we frame sin as just doing bad things, then it just becomes another mantra in all the other things they fail at. Like, you're fat, you're stupid, you're weak, oh, and you're a sinner too. And it just pushes them in many ways deeper into isolation. So then what is sin concretely? I think sin concretely is death. It's the experience of death. It's the reality of death. The great Saint Athanasius actually said, sin is decreation. It's not the participation in the good, in the bringing forth. It's participation in the nothingness of death. So in the garden, we hear the words, now you shall surely die. In this grieving voice of God, now that our relationship is broken, now you shall surely die. Barth says this, he says, death is the divine command, stop, and we cannot disobey it. Through its narrow gates, we must pass. So death is the fullness of broken relationship. And if there's anything that adolescents feel, it is the tension and the pulling apart of relationship and of negotiating relationship. And as human beings, we desperately, deeply need relationship. And death is the ending of relationship, and it's why it's so horrific. We had this experience in our family that was a very difficult one. One of Cara's best friends, Steph, that she had grown up with, they'd gone to church with their whole lives. Steph had a brother named Taylor, and Taylor had been adopted when Steph was, 11 or 12 years old. So the poor boy was, with a junior high girl in his house, was dressed in dresses, and he was the plaything for all these junior high girls as they dressed him up. But he was just this happy-go-lucky kid. Well, that all changed when he was 13. And when he was 13, it just kind of hit him as a kind of existential crisis that his birth mother had given him up. And he just had a hard time dealing with this. And as he grew older, the happy-go-lucky kid just kind of disappeared. And it would come back at times, but he dealt with severe depression. And he kind of went through these kind of bipolar moves. And when he would go through from these kind of bipolar drops from being up to down, he would often act out in a very negative way. And he would use drugs, he'd be risky with his sexuality, and then he would drive very fast and very recklessly. Well, this particular night, he's 21 years old, he runs a red light, is hit by a car, and is killed instantly. Utterly tragic, 21-year-old kid. So, of course, we spend a great deal of time with the family and just the utter heartbreak of this. Well, it gets to the time of the funeral, and Steph asks Cara if she will stand with her at the funeral because Steph would like to eulogize her brother. But Steph is absolutely 100% afraid of public speaking. It's awful to her. So she wants Cara to hold her hand so she can eulogize her brother and give her support as she does that. So we get to sit in the front row of this packed sanctuary at this funeral. And it becomes time for Steph to come forward, and she goes forward, and we're sitting close by. And somehow, in the midst of this, she gains the inner strength, and she tells Cara she can sit, that she can do this by herself. But still, we're in the front row, so we have this view of her. And she gets up in an utter beauty. She eulogizes her brother in just utter strength, pouring from every pore of her body. But it was interesting because a number of times she would say, Taylor. Taylor was like this. Taylor was like that. And it was almost as if she could objectify her brother in a name. She did it with strength. But about a half dozen times, she said these words. She said, oh, my brother, my brother. And when she would say, oh, my brother, it was almost as if you could see through her. And that something inside of her was dying. And in a real sense, it was. I mean, there are no sisters without brothers, and this was her only brother that was leaving the world. That in a sense, she is the relationships that make her. And death is the great enemy because it pulls apart and separates these relationships that are so core to us as we negotiate them and know them. So ask a kid being bullied or whose parents are divorcing if it feels like death, and they will say yes. And they will often not be upset about those experiences because they find them immoral. They feel upset about them and even righteous indignation about them because they feel thrust into experiences of death. They feel like death is thrown at them. So when kids ask us, what is sin? I think it would be helpful for us to say that sin is death in all of its friends. It's a great Coldplay quote from one of their songs, Viva la Vida, where Chris Martin sings, I don't want to serve death in all of its friends. And in many ways, sin is death in all of its friends. And maybe the great act of discipleship that we're calling our young people into is to live a life where they trust in the action of Jesus Christ for them so they need not serve death in all of its friends. To think of sin as death in all of its friends. Well, this does then lead us into having to talk about this, which is when sin moves into sinning. So to think of sin as a broken reality and moving it away from doing bad things doesn't mean that we just take kids off the hook and say, well, whatever you want to do is fine because it doesn't matter. Actually, it does matter deeply. So that the reality is that we can move into sinning action where we do things that are even evil and wrong when we actually participate in death, when we fear death, when we serve death. One of the great deceptions of death is that it whispers in our ear, and we give in to sin when we hear its whisper that says, if you will serve me, I will protect you. If you will serve me, I will protect you. Now that sounds like highfalutin philosophical talk, but just spend some time with some junior high girls, and you will see a laboratory of this playing itself out. I don't know if you've ever been on a retreat with junior high girls and watched them be so utterly mean to each other. And it's not that junior high boys aren't mean to each other too. It's just that girls are particularly skilled at it at 7th and 8th grade. And they're so mean to each other. And then sometimes you'll pull one of them aside and say, why are you being like this? Why are you being so mean? And one often, especially the most articulate one, will say, I don't know. I don't know. And they'll essentially say, but all I know is it's either her or it's me. And so it's got to be her. And so they pick the one to thrust into make the problem so that they uphold themselves. That they realize that it's either I'm the ass of the joke or you're the ass of the joke, so I will make you the ass of the joke. And so we enter into sinning activity. We move from the reality of brokenness into actually participating in it when we actually serve death. And we often serve it because of fear. We're deceived into thinking that if we serve death, we'll be protected from it, which is the great deception of it. And so in many ways, it's very bad religion, and we've done this too often with adolescents to make them afraid. Because fear is the very kind of starting point to wanting to serve death, is when we feel afraid, which is why Jesus says so often in the Gospels, fear not. Fear not, that you are free, that you are saved, that your life belongs to me, that you need not serve death because your destiny is bound in me. Maybe another couple examples of this. So sin leads to fear, which often leads into sinning. A couple examples, maybe even from my own life, is I've noticed once we bought our house that I had this thing that I called the magical $2,000, where once we bought our house, I realized I never had enough money. I don't know if anyone's had this experience, and I think we feel this way in our churches. Like, you ask people to give money, and they never have enough money, and you're like, you have 3 BMWs. How can't you have enough money? But part of it is the way that even this broken reality of sin participates, where we feel like, I don't have enough money, because if you ask me for money, I think, well, I need $2,000 more because just in case our roof leaks, and I need $2,000 more just in case one of my kids gets sick, and then I need $2,000 more just in case when our car breaks down. And you always need $2,000 more because you're afraid that something bad could happen, because you're afraid of the future. So you always need this. So when your neighbor comes at your door asking for help in need, you don't have any money to give them, even though you might have $100,000 in the bank, because you're always afraid of your tomorrow. Again, Jesus releasing us from this fear. Or maybe this turns me into an utter dork. But isn't this the mythology of Anakin Skywalker? Now, you've all just lost huge amounts of respect for me if you haven't already. You're like, oh my gosh, this guy is such a nerd. But all right, go with me. I'm actually ashamed to say this, but it's a good analogy. If you've ever watched Star Wars, first of all, the mythology of Star Wars doesn't quite work with the dualism, but how Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader is an incredible example of this. If you've watched these movies, and some of you are looking at me like, what the heck just happened here? But if you watch these movies, Anakin Skywalker, remember how he becomes Darth Vader? He becomes Darth Vader because his own mother is killed by the Sand People. Now I feel terrible. I feel really nerdy. But remember, his own mother is killed by the Sand People, and then he falls in love with Padme, and he gets utterly afraid that he will lose her too. And he gets so afraid that he is actually taken in to serve the dark side, so that sin comes into this broken reality and actually whispers to him, if you will serve me, I will protect you. And this happens with young people all the time, that young people enter into these behaviors that end up really hurting their lives, often because they're utter fear of where they stand and if they have any place to belong at all. Or let me tell you my greatest moment of sin. And now you're like, hey, this is why I came. Yeah, give me the gossip. So this is, actually, I've done worse things than this, but it's a good analogy to this. When I was in college, at the college that I was going to, they had like this late night over finals where they would serve like breakfast and food at like 2 a.m. So while you were studying, you could come. And you wouldn't know this by looking at me, I'm sure, but I actually didn't have a lot of luck with the ladies in college. You're like, no, not you. I don't believe that for a second. But I always had my eye on a couple girls that I always struck out with. But we were in this cafeteria. It was finals. It was late. We were all eating. And they would just shove the tables in on this because everyone would flood for free food. It was college students. So I was sitting with my buddy and these 2 girls that we hung out with. And this girl walked by that I kind of had the hots for. And one of my buddies kind of elbowed me and said, hey, there she is. And I got a little embarrassed and felt a little exposed. And the girls kind of saw that. And they said, oh, is that Tammy? You got the hots for Tammy? And it wasn't Tammy. But I felt vulnerable, and I felt isolated, and I felt scared within my own being. So I said, Tammy? Hell no, that's not Tammy. Why would I like Tammy? Tammy's disgusting. That's not Tammy. No way would I like Tammy. Now, to my utter shock, literally sitting right behind me is Tammy. And she got up and she did exactly what she should have done, which she gave me this look like, who the bleepity bleep do you think you are? Which was the right response, and walked away. Now what happened? Tammy didn't deserve that. Tammy didn't deserve that at all. And I ended up doing something. I did a sinning act because I felt the reality of sin. I felt alone and isolated and vulnerable. I felt my being at stake. So to protect myself, I threw this poor woman under the bus. And I think this becomes the reality when we actually participate in these things, which is the beauty of the gospel itself. To talk about sin in this way moves us deeply into the gospel, where Athanasius actually says that the word enters into death so that you are free not to serve death anymore. That God in Jesus Christ enters into death so that you need not serve it anymore. Or Paul says, I have died with Christ and I'm now made alive with Christ. So it's true that things like cheating and lying and stealing and certain forms of isolation that dehumanize, we often do these because of fear of death, because we fear death. So sinning is participation then in this broken communion, in broken community. And the beauty is that Jesus gives us new community through death so that we need not serve death anymore. This beauty of the gospel as we talk about it with young people. So how do we actually talk about it with young people to get our feet on the ground just a little bit? Well, I think the first thing that we learn as we talk about sin with young people is that we should be wary of throwing them into their own subjectivity, and into their own behavior. It is really easy to make kids feel bad about themselves, or to kind of ignite in them this kind of performance gene to do better. Instead, I think we want to invite them to articulate their experiences of death, the experiences that are done to them and that they've done to others, to actually articulate these experiences. And maybe the biblical text, at least to me, the beautiful story that frames this, and maybe it's a model for how we think about youth ministry in general, is the great story of Mark 9. You know, Mark 9 starts with this father who is having a rough time. His boy is sick, and sick beyond sick. I mean, scary sick now. The boy is doing things that are very, very scary. And we don't have the backstory of this father, but being a father, being a parent, you can kind of get the anxiety and the idea behind it. I mean, when your kid is not doing well, the utter fear of that kind of overcomes you. And you get this sense that this father has tried everything to heal this boy, but none of it is working. So he hears about this healer from Nazareth, and he's going to go. He's not on his health plan, but he doesn't matter. He's going to go to him. So he heads off to him and walks however long it takes to walk, quite a journey with this sick boy. And he gets to the disciples and is actually told that Jesus isn't there. I mean, it must have been tragic. You can think every step that this man is taking, he's thinking, this is going to be it. This is going to work. Like his hope is building. This one is going to work. This one is going to take. None of the other doctors have worked. None of the other healers have worked. This one is going to work. Every step. And then he gets there, and the disciples say, hey, sorry, bad luck for you, but Jesus is actually on vacation. He took 3 of his buddies, and they went up on a mountain on a kind of romance kind of time away. So Jesus is up, and the transfiguration happens. He's up there with Peter, James, and John, and they're having a great time. And, you know, stuff happens, like Sixth Sense happens, where they start seeing dead people, you know, like Elijah and Moses start showing up. But here's this father, and you got to think the utter heartbreak. Now he comes, and Jesus isn't there. So what does he say? He turns to the disciples and says, then you do it. You heal him. We haven't walked all this way for nothing. And I've been hoping that this was going to work. You do something. In tragedy of all tragedy, the disciples try to cast out this demon of this boy, and it doesn't work. And now the father has to just be thinking, I am God forsaken. This is what I have to bear. Look at my boy. I am losing him here. This is it. This is it. And he is just utterly in pain. And Jesus comes walking back in from his mountain getaway, still with coolers in hand, and there's commotion. And he asks the disciples what's happened, and they explain it. Jesus has a few harsh words for his disciples, and then he turns to the Father, and he says these utterly beautiful words that I think are formative for our ministry. He says, how long? How long has your boy been like this? And we get the impression as kind of late modern, medical age people that it is the question of diagnosis. Like, how long have you had that rash? How long have you had that cough? But really, it doesn't correlate with any of the other miracles Jesus does. Really, the how long is the invitation for this father to tell his story, to articulate that which haunts him and holds him down. And the father says, how long? For a lifetime or more. And maybe a huge piece of youth ministry. Maybe youth ministry that deals with even how to talk about tragedy and brokenness and sin with young people is actually to invite them to articulate how long. How long have you felt that way? How long have you thought that way about yourself? How long have you felt alone? How long have things been so chaotic in your neighborhood or in your house? How long? That articulation of how long is utterly beautiful. And Jesus gives this space for this man to say, how long? And he explains it for a lifetime or more. But teacher, if you are able, he says, if you are able. And Jesus' words are beautiful. It says, if I am able. If I am able, now referencing back to Transfiguration, if I am able, I see dead people. I just talked to Moses and Elijah. If I am able, all things are possible for those who believe. And then the great statement of faith, maybe the great statement of adolescent faith, where the Father says, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. Back into communion. I actually wonder, going all the way back to conclude, to that student who told the story about the mother who was upset that her 6-year-old daughter was told that she was a sinner. I actually wonder if the daughter would have been helped to hear and the mother would have been shared, if they would have shared with the mother, that when we talk about sin, what we mean is this broken, tragic reality that your daughter experiences now and will experience forevermore, of feeling isolated and alone, in the depth of the good news of the gospel, that God comes near to her in those moments, turning all that's dead into life. If the mother wouldn't have actually said, not only do I get that intellectually, but do I get it in my own heart. So taking this turn from thinking about sin as doing bad things to entering deeply into allowing young people to articulate their stories of that which haunts them and to share deeply into their lives is a way that we not only talk about sin, but actually embody the new life and new hope that God promises us in and through sin. That is the great, I think, Easter message. Let me pray for us. God, thanks for these brave people who have come just 2 days after Easter in all the exhaustion and yet beauty of that time. I thank you, God, that they've given of their time to be here, and pray that in some small way it has been a blessing. But we even pray more so, God, that as they leave this place, that they might be reminded by your Spirit that they are a great blessing to the church, that they are participating deeply in what it is you're doing in the world, God. So open their minds and their hearts, and in all things encourage them. Amen. Thanks, you guys, for being here, especially 2 days after Easter. So it's been a pleasure. I think we're at 1:30 now, so we'll kind of pause and let people who need to depart. And then I think we have time for, is it fair time for 10 or 12 minutes or so of question and answer where I can clarify things if need be. So please feel free to depart if you need to, and then I'll take a drink of water, and then we can enter into question and answer. All right, so let's just take a couple minutes. Again, if you need to leave at any point, feel no shame in that. People will just throw jelly beans at you as you go. That's why they're there, I think. But what might be helpful? Any questions that linger for you? Yeah.
If you can repeat the question.
Repeat the question for the feed. Yep.
What you were proposing as far as this approach toward dealing with sin with kids really is, I can't speak for everybody here, but for those of us who work in youth ministry, that's pretty profound, because a lot of these kids are really driven. A lot of my kids are certainly driven all the time. Do the right thing, get the right grades, National Honor Society, all these different things, because all their future all depends upon it. And it's not unlike what we and the church has historically pushed on them as well. And so you're really looking at a different approach to understanding faith for a lot of these kids, I think.
Yeah, so if I can repeat your question, you can tell me if I got it enough. But make the comment, and I'll respond to it, which I think is a really helpful one, is that in a way, there's a paradigm shift here, because most of our young people come to our churches and are really kind of driven towards the future and directed towards it. Honor society, I want to play varsity this, I got to do that, I got to go to these camps. And there's this sense of kind of, like I said earlier, this escalator ride up towards advancement, growth, preparation. And to think about sin this way, in some sense, undercuts some of those kind of cultural ambitions. Is that a fair way to repeat that? Yeah, and I mean, one of the ways I would frame that, and this is probably a longer conversation we have time for, but there's this great quote by the German theologian Eberhard Jungel. And Jungel says this great line where he says, when the church talks about faith, no doubt the church needs to talk about the process of faith. But the church better not, he says, in this kind of prophetic, profound line, better not focus so much on the process of faith that it misses the object of faith. And one of my concerns, the process of faith, like what curriculum we need, how kids need to come, what are the stages they need to go through, to the object of faith, like God, and how God acts and moves within our midst. And I worry within youth ministry so often that we have tended to, the youth ministry world has tended to live so much in the process of faith. And we're all really concerned about the process. Like, we've seen that a lot of kids aren't in church, that kids even in youth groups aren't in churches when they're 25, 26, 27. And that's all incredibly important, and we need to deal with that. But I don't want us to focus on the process outside the object of faith. And one of the interesting things I think about when we make sin about doing bad things is it tends to over-perpetuate the process. So the process is about keeping kids good, and we will know that they're good because they'll be, top of their class in this, or they'll never drink, or they'll never make this mistake, and so it ends up all being about the process. And I want us to even, I think the depth of the theological tradition, I'm thinking about kind of sin and brokenness, is to point us again to this God who enters deeply into this reality. So profound, I appreciate you saying that. I don't know how profound, but I do want to turn us towards thinking deeply about who God is and how God acts. And I think youth ministry is a particularly interesting place to ask those really deep theological questions, because I think these things bubble up. And I think adolescence is a time where kids feel this utter drive towards advancing growth and preparation. But yet, and this is how I would not, actually in this book called Taking the Cross to Youth Ministry, I try to define adolescence not as advancement, growth, and preparation, but as being caught between possibility and nothingness. And I think it's something that's true for all of us, that we're all caught between possibility and nothingness. But in adolescence, you become very conscious of it. And, and you feel it all the time, where you're told, like, you can do whatever you want with your life. There's so much possibility before you. You can do whatever you want, but you'll never play varsity soccer. Like the juxtaposition of those things are almost mind-bending. Or, your whole life's before you. You can do it. If you just work hard, you can do it. But, he will never go to prom with you. Like these people will never be your friend. So you're always bouncing back in between possibility and nothingness. And so where do we seek for God in the midst of it? And to quote Eberhard Jungel again, Jungel has this other beautiful quote, maybe in the same book, I can't remember, where he says, God is found, God is between possibility and nothingness. God is found between possibility and nothingness. Yeah. What else would be helpful? Yeah, way in the back.
How do you deal with a teenager who's raised in the church their whole life and then all of a sudden now is struggling with their faith?
Yeah.
Like as a senior in high school with all the different stresses and tragedy.
Yeah.
How do you were kind of touching on that when you were saying like how long have you felt this way?
Yep. It's a really good question. I think one that we often feel, and to repeat it for the camera again, is how do we just deal with young people in our youth groups or in our churches who simply are in the midst of really doubting their faith? Would that be a fair way to say it? Or just really kind of wrestling and struggling with it?
How can there be a God that allows a tragedy?
Yeah.
What happened in Fanny Hub?
Yeah, of course. And especially in the backdrop of so many tragedies, whether they're natural disasters or they're horrific crimes like happen in schools, how can God, where is God in the midst of that? Yeah. At one level, those larger theodicy questions, as we would say, those larger questions like how can a good God allow bad to happen in the world, are things that we can, in many ways, never answer. They're unanswerable questions, I think, in many ways. And they're questions that always have to be held very lightly, I think, by us, and yet held in a way that we embrace the humanity of those who ask it. I think sometimes you will get a kid who will just ask those questions philosophically, but usually those questions are asked from very deep questions themselves. Like, to kind of think about the Father in Mark 9, he may have asked at his men's Bible study morning, he may have asked a question like, how could a good God allow sick children in Africa to die? Well, that is a big theodicy question, but he also asks that question not just because it's philosophical, but because it's also deeply existential. Like, he's wrestling with, how can God allow my son to be sick? Where is God in the midst of it? And I think the one I think trap we can fall into youth ministry, where we think it's our job to solve all those problems for kids. And that I think we sometimes feel like that, like, you're the professional now, and you better be able to solve all those problems, or you have failed at your job. And I think if we go down that road, that we run into a huge, huge problem. I don't think that we can solve all those. I think actually our job is to invite young people to actually articulate them, and to articulate them in the depth that they have them. And I tend to believe that when young people articulate those experiences of how long, or of great doubt, that when doubt is shared or suffering is shared, that it is this experience of participating in something new. And I think there's this sense, especially in the world we live in, that doubt can never be extracted even from our Christian lives, that we always are doubting it. But I think the call is to doubt it with a group of people that continue to proclaim it while we doubt it. So I think to say to young people, continue to doubt, continue to wrestle, but continue to wrestle here. Continue to wrestle with us is an actual act of faith. It is much like the Father in Mark 9 who says, I believe, help my unbelief. And I think giving young people and allowing them to live inside of that, I believe, help my unbelief, as normal maybe isn't the right way to say it, but as not demonic or diabolical, but as something that invites communion and embrace and belonging, I think is a way forward within that. I mean, it's a great question with incredible depth, but that's how I would begin to think about it. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, good. Okay.
I'm the parent of a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, and I experience my kids in terms of behaviors as very concrete.
Yeah.
Very concrete.
Uh-huh.
And they may have the capacity to do abstract reasoning in some parts of their life, but when it comes to behavior, it's concrete and it's tribal.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about talking about sins as acts is at least it's a concrete thing. Yeah. And I see that you're saying it's an opening into this deeper discussion. I'm not sure if my teenagers, I mean, we've been talking about God all their lives, you know, sort of an occupational hazard. And my son had an interesting experience. He decided when he went off to college he wasn't going to drink. So very concrete decision. I'm not going to engage in this kind of activity. And his girlfriend went out one night drinking and ended up going home with someone. And he was horribly devastated, violated. But he also felt the affirmation of making that decision not to do that behavior because he saw how much her doing it had unraveled and destroyed their relationship. So I'm still kind of stuck back on square one about actions, and maybe not sinful actions, but sanctifying actions, making a decision to give your allegiance to sanctifying actions in a tribe that endorses that code.
So I have to now the task of repeating what you said, which this is a really hard job. Did the mic pick that up? Because you said it so beautifully. I'm not so sure that I can. So I'll just try to answer it. It's a great question. Like, when you just make sin doing bad things, it is very concrete. And if you start saying things like, "Well, sin is death," then it seems less concrete. It seems abstract. I think that is a legitimate danger in moving this direction or thinking in this way. However, I wouldn't want to actually ever talk about the experience of death or isolation or nothingness outside of concrete experiences. And even your story about your son, I think, touches on that, where he sees these. I mean, the girlfriend who does the thing actually isn't participating in something that thrusts isolation and death upon him. I mean, it's acts done that actually serve death instead of life. So it's not to extract our action from that, but it is to try to move our action away from kind of performative escalator that you can kind of work yourself work yourself towards this, to our action participating in a God who brings forth life out of death. So something close to sanctification in that sense, that sanctification moving in this way. And I like the way you talk about the kind of that tribal element of it too, which I think is where, kind of back to the other questions, narration becomes so significant. That when we tell our stories how long, inside of people who hear those stories, there's ways that our lives get bound together within that. That is really deeply powerful. And I think this is part of what I want us to think deeply about in youth ministry is how many kids have deep stories of how long and have no one to hear those stories. That feel like there's no one there that can actually hear them. And actually will think things like, well, I'm just a bad kid anyhow, so I don't know what to do about that. Or maybe another story, and I don't know that this gets exactly right at your question, but maybe highlights it, is that at our little church that Cara is the pastor of, it's just a small little church, Presbyterian church, city church, but we do some kind of unique things, and one of the unique things we do is every fifth Sunday we don't have church at our church. We go to a children's home and have church at this children's home. It's called St. Joe's Children's Home. Kids who are there because they either committed a crime or have just lived in deeply difficult situations. But we go and we kind of do a kind of classic Presbyterian liturgy there and have a service with these kids. One of the most powerful things for me one week I was there is that we did the prayer of confession. And this particular liturgy was really about, confessing all the things that I've done. But looking at these kids, I thought, man, someone, and maybe the church needs to be the voice that does this, someone needs to confess our sins we've done to them. Like, these kids are clearly guilty for things. Like, these kids have clearly done actions that are guilty, but they also are thrust into a system where they've been abandoned and other people have hurt them that have sent them to think that they can only hold up their own being by hurting other people. So I'm wondering about those kids who are pushed out into forms of isolation and where the church is so often kind of what they've heard, whether it's what we've said or not, what they've heard is, I'm not a good enough kid to ever be here. I do all these bad things, as opposed to this community actually wants to hear and participate in your articulation of how long, and actually wants to hear your confession of the actions you've done that have participated in sin, but also confess to you that you have unfairly or tragically been pushed in to this reality of death and sin as well. So it's a good question. I guess I'm biased because my 8-year-old talks concretely about death all the time. And there is a sense where I think death and nothingness are incredibly concrete things. And just really practically, one of the areas I've been able to get at this with young people in my own ministry has been through certain forms of art. I know a youth pastor who does something really beautiful where his confirmation class, he has them, he buys them each an iTunes card, and they come, each kid comes one week with a song, and it's a song that just haunts them, that just makes them think these big thoughts, and then they talk about them, and he kind of does theology on his feet with them within that. In other ways, I've done it in the own confirmation class that I teach, is to invite young people to kind of share their stories and to think about what they're afraid of about their life, of where they'll be in 5 years or things like that. So, it's a good point, and I think I've just touched on the beginning of it. So, would you want to follow up with that?
So you're saying that when we talk about death and nothingness, we do need to link it to concrete actions.
No doubt.
And you're saying that we shouldn't underestimate kids having an analogous experience of death and nothingness.
Yeah, I would want to actually open up space for them to articulate that experience. And I think what it is me then helping, me as the youth worker, helping interpret those experiences and hear those back more than it's me just saying, this is what's going on with you, and let me draw that on the board. But actually opening up a space for them to articulate their experience and then thinking through that experience. Yes, for sure. Anything else, or have I beat you into submission? Maybe one more, is that fair? Yep. I think I win. No. All right.
You talk about kids articulating their experience, but I find many of the kids have no practice ever doing that. How would you go about helping kids to do that?
Yeah. That is really true, and I think it connects these, is that we do have a generation of kids who it's a hard thing, especially in the cultural context that we live within, because there's no time in the history of humanity that they don't have more devices to be able to tell their story, and yet they seem, I mean, I don't know, just go on Facebook now, and people don't tell good stories on there. Like, hey, this is what I had for lunch. Like, hey, I don't care. So there's more and more opportunities to tell your story and be articulate, and yet it does feel like a lot of them are not very articulate. And, I probably told this story, I'm sure I've told this story here. When you've been somewhere 3 times, you have to hear stories over and over again. But the story that remains significant for me, or let me say it this way, that you're right. I think if you just sit a kid down and say, tell me your story and make this concrete, they will not be able to do it. That we learn how to tell a story by hearing stories. And this becomes a really significant piece for us that's formative for our own vocations. That I think who we become are people who tell our own story. So it goes back to your point, like we have to become the ones who tell our own stories of wrestling with death and with nothingness. Again, we have to be very, very aware of power dynamics in that, and not using, and think of the difference between confession and disclosure. I mean, I think that's something that's very, very confusing in our cultural context, especially with Facebook and Twitter and things like that, that people think that they're confessing things and they're really just disclosing. And disclosure, confession leads to the reconnection of community and relationship. Disclosure often is a power game. That now I've given you this information and now I'm in control of you in some sense. So back to your question, that it does have a ton to do with us actually hearing stories. So I think it's about us actually being able to tell these kind of stories that then invite them to share their own. And this is, I mean, even in neuroscience, this is how they're saying that we learn to tell stories as well as how conversations work, is that our brains work in a certain way that when we hear someone tell a story, and you've had all this experience with your own friends, that you hear a story and all of a sudden they've taken pictures of the brain, that things will light up and you will connect your story to their story. You're like, oh my gosh, that happened to you, that happened to me. And then you almost like a reflex start telling your story. But if someone just sits you down and says, so tell me the time that you were the saddest you've ever been. You're like, I can't even recollect such an experience. But if you hear somebody articulate a time where they really doubted God or really were wrestling with God, then all of a sudden you start to it almost comes out of you. So I think it starts by young people hearing us tell our stories a lot. That's why for my own students at Luther Seminary, a huge piece of what I try to do is get them to tell their own story. Because if they can tell their own story, it creates a space for others to tell their story. Which gets to the story that I overtell more than probably I should. But and I think I did tell this in October. But Parker Palmer has this great little piece in one of his books where he talks about a study they did. Did I tell you the story before? The study they did that they tried to discover what was the one thing that led an undergraduate to like a class. You hear the story? Yeah, you know the story. So they do this study. Some of you haven't heard it, hopefully. I'll pretend you haven't. They tried to discover what was the one component that led an undergraduate to like a class. And they thought it might have to do with performance. So they took this physics 101 class, asked these students, do you like this class, love this class? Well, did you get an A? No, I did not get an A. I barely passed this class. I no. So okay, so it's not performance. So they thought, well, maybe it's subject matter. So they asked them, so you didn't do well in this class, but do you love physics? No. Hate physics. Never take a physics class again. Did you get this requirement? I will never, ever be part of it. But you like this class? Yeah, I like this class. So they continued to ask them. They found out there was one variable that led to undergraduates liking the class. The one variable was this, that the students perceived that the course really mattered to the professor. So they would say, I hated physics, I barely passed, but I love this class because when I would show up at 8:30, it was very clear to me this class mattered to Professor Johnson. And I think that's a huge way we pass on faith to young people in a concrete way that gets them to really wrestle with their stories, which is for it to matter to us and for us to tell stories in a way that get into our own questions of how long in an appropriate way, that then opens them up to share their own. So I think that part of youth ministry is teaching kids how to tell stories. I think that's a huge piece of the Christian life, is learning how to tell stories. After all, I mean, Christianity is committed to story. We have 4 Gospels that are, somehow oddly connected because we couldn't decide which one story to have because we're so much people of story. And I think there's something really significant in the midst of that. And the interesting thing is that story, it is not a good movie to watch a movie like, I don't know, maybe I'll find this analogy not working, but Les Mis. Like, the story of Les Mis would have just been like, well, the guy was bad he just did a bad thing for stealing that bread. It's a bad story. If it goes just to the moralistic and not opens up to deeper realities and you see behind situations and you see the wrestling with these situations, where you see the character in multiple dimensions, it tends not to be a good story. I think that's an interesting way to think about it, is that when sin becomes about doing bad things, we often break down the kind of layers of narration that actually exist inside of it to kind of make it a clean reason that things went bad or that you're bad. Anyhow, let's stop there before I say something on tape that I regret. So thanks for coming. Thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it. And have a great day.